Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm really excited for the panel. So I have with me Shobha from Walmart Labs, Daniel from Vorwerk, Michael from Schneider, and Rishikesh from Netmagic. Yeah. So, so before we start with the panel, I think if you can introduce yourself to the attendees, and then we will go ahead and start with the question answers.
Okay. Hi all. Good morning. My name is Shobha. I manage the information security group in Walmart Labs.
Hi, I'm Daniel Cisowski, and I'm the CISO of the Vorwerk group, responsible for information security.
I'm Mike Pyle. I'm responsible for cybersecurity of the offers that our business develops at Schneider Electric.
Hi, I'm Rishikesh. I head the business for managed security at Netmagic.
All right. So the first question is, what are your viewpoints on past attacks that you have seen or experienced? You don't have to say, but specifically on IoT. So this is, everybody can take this question.
Okay. So, from an IoT perspective, there are a number of attacks that have been in the mainstream media, right? Almost pretty much everybody knows about the Mirai botnet and, the IoT Reaper botnet that was getting built and a couple of those things before that as well. So, when we talk about IoT and security perspective of an IoT, there are two ways that we need to be looking at it. One is what damage the IoT systems can cause to somebody else, and the other one is the other way around, which is what damage can be caused to the IoT systems in themselves, right? So the former one is where you see a number of large-scale DDoS attacks happening, where there's a lot of media attention garnered. And the latter one is where you have the likes of Jeep being hacked into, or you have hackers getting onto a plane and trying to get onto the onboard device communication and stuff like that, right? So the latter one is where I think there is more risk, more damage in terms of the fact that this is IoTs could also lead to a loss of human life or degradation of human life. So from that perspective, that one is much more dangerous. As we were discussing earlier, thankfully, I have not been personally the recipient of any such attack. But that's not to say that it may not happen to me or to anybody that I know in the future. So yeah, that's really my perspective on this.
And I just think that we need to look at how these attacks occurred. So many of these devices were out there with default credentials in place. We really need to educate our users in terms of what they need to do to secure these devices when they deploy them. And there's also steps I think that we can do as suppliers of these types of devices to require the end users to change the security settings before they're actually able to fully leverage those devices once they're deployed. So I think there's something on us as manufacturers that we can do, but still a lot of awareness and education we need to provide to our end users on how to use them.
And even we should force them to do so before they can, use these devices. So basically establish security by default and ensure that those devices won't work either you configure them correctly or you have a default settings that are already secure.
So just to talk about the Mirai itself, I'm not sure if it can be truly classified as an IoT-based attack. So if we just think about how the attack was done or how this worm was built, the worm was written in C. All it does is a scanning of all the IP addresses. And once it finds an IP that can be telnet, port 23, that's it, go into the device. Once it goes into the device, it kills all other processes which will try it not to run, and then reach out to its command server that is written in Go, and then start waiting to get commands so that it can work on the attack or the next steps. Meanwhile, it will also scan in and around other devices or the IP addresses where it can get in. So it's a worm, right? So it has to go into other devices. So, but what does it actually exploit? It actually exploited a simple thing that is available in all the manuals of the devices. Username, password. That comes as an out-of-box mechanism to configure a device. So, though it is as simple as this, how many of us use dongles? All of us use. Have you actually gone and changed the user ID and password that is there with the dongle? Right? Most of us won't do it. We, being in this domain, understand the risk of using a device. I don't know whether to classify a dongle as an IoT device or not. Don't do it. So how do you expect all our citizens who just use it to connect and use the bandwidth internet, they take such precautions and ensure that their data that is getting exchanged is safe? So though I have not experienced any personal IoT attacks, it becomes very important for us to create that awareness. Any device that you see is able to connect can be the cause to put you in trouble. So spread this awareness and also ensure that when you use any of the device, remove the default user ID and password to help yourself protected from any attacks that may come in.
So Michael, what are your views on existing standards and guidelines that can be applied to IoT or IIoT? Do we have those standards, or do we really need to build them?
Do we have the standards defined today for IoT and IIoT? To some extent, the answer is yes. What we've got to do is take the IEC 62443 and identify those requirements, identify the schema that we need to apply to IIoT devices, and then we can certify to that, which gets us a step in the right direction. We have to be thinking security all the way, and we need to be thinking about security at a system level, how this whole entire ecosystem works with the IoT. And I'll let Daniel answer it more for IoT. I think he's got that.
Well, I believe, there's a lot of standards out there, and the challenge is for IoT, for these devices with so small resources, to use them appropriately, to combine them, to make the people that work with the hardware use these standards, to work the people that create software on top of it, that create all those cloud services, make the guidelines for them, best practices to use certain standards together and establish, integrate them into the entire development process, make them think of those already at the design phase. And as agile methodologies are very common in the development of IoT, integrate them into the CI/CD cycles. That's key, I believe. Automation is very important at that place.
From my perspective, I think Bruce Kirchner has already requested the government to have a policy. And sometimes humans don't adhere to do right things if there is no penalty imposed on them. So it becomes, government plays a very key role in enforcing regulations, frameworks, policies for everyone to follow, so that at least some aspects of security are taken care. An example is PCI. It is mandated that if you don't follow the guidelines, you will be penalized, and you already see all corporates falling in place and ensure that they handle customer data, specifically dealing with credit cards, very securely. So IEEE has got 802.15.4, which gives guidelines on what IoT standards should be, IoT-based devices should be using when they do the deployments. And OWASP has come up with a lot of guidelines, testing tools and tips that should be used whenever you are looking at IoT solutions.
Okay. I think I pretty much agree with the rest of the panel that in general, we don't necessarily need a different set of, let's say guidelines and other things. Because from a security perspective, we already have ISO 27001, we have standards which are there, which kind of do enumerate the best practices that should be there and what kind of controls that need to be put into place. And if you look at the IoT architecture as such, it's actually no different from what a typical enterprise architecture would be, right? The difference comes in terms of the scale. So in an enterprise, you might have 2,000 endpoints. When you roll out IoT, you probably end up with 20,000 or even 2 million endpoints, right? So the scale is something that's really important. But when it comes to security, the standards that are existing are pretty much ones that can be adopted to the current IoT environment as well. There's just one thing though, which is there could be certain classes of IoT devices which are far more crucial, like pacemakers or medical equipments, which could have the potential of causing damage to the human into the human self. And I think that's something that has not been till date covered by any of the security standards, because most of the security standards talk about protecting data, confidentiality, privacy, but they don't talk about what happens if a human actually gets impacted, there is physical damage to the human that happens. So I think from that one perspective alone is a gap that would need to be filled out.
Yeah, exactly. So from my perspective, I think every domain is trying to define standards, but what they're looking at right now is more of safety standards. So you talk about transportation, for example, aeroplanes. They would define safety standards for the devices or the equipment that is deployed. Talk about healthcare. They would define safety standards for, the device shouldn't blow up if it's a pacemaker, for example. But I don't see people talking about these are the set of security issues that can be there at a hardware level. So it doesn't matter whether it's deployed in OT or a hospital, as long as it is a PCB board, it'll have certain generalized security issues which you see in hardware. So as a security community, what do you guys think we should be doing? Should we go ahead and speak to the organizations or vendors and create like a consortium or something and try to define these guidelines more specifically from sensor perspective? Because we don't see these guidelines here. So what is the correct step? Do we go and talk to the government, or do we start defining it ourselves within our organization for our products, or do we create a consortium and then go ahead and define a generalized guideline or a standard?
So TCS is already having an open source security community that is driving a lot of things specifically in IoT area. Similarly, Microsoft also has its own focus and driving a lot of contribution with respect to the security guidelines in IoT area. So if each of these organizations, I'm not telling that they should not do things independently, but security is a collaborative area. So if we talk about Mirai, if I go back to that example, the entire source code was open sourced. Now the same code has been used and advanced techniques to attack has been come up. So if that world is making benefit of open source and coming up with advanced technique, why not the white world, right? We need to collaborate well among the industries. All corporates needs to collaborate well as individuals, because this is something that would affect our lives in future. We also need to contribute back to it and come up with the guidelines similar to the CSA. So the Cloud Security Alliance started. It is not a government body, but every individual contributing to it and coming up with a standard as of now, I think that is used as a basic standard for any cloud assessment. So I strongly believe that everyone here, everyone in the world has to collaborate well, contribute, make the standards available so that wherever the devices are used, it is secure and humans are not affected at the end of the day.
You're right. If you mention the Cloud Security Alliance, for example, cloud was something quite new, and of course, it required new change of paradigms and new requirements to be collected together, for example, in a standard or a kind of a policy. However, IoT devices, if we ask ourselves how we can make them secure, then I don't think that we need another guideline. I believe what we need is to combine the standards that we already have out there in a kind of a best practice and think about what is really needed to make the entire ecosystem secure, to make the hardware secure, to make the software on top of it secure, as well as cloud services if any are used. And there is a lot of research done in this direction, and we can also learn from previous breaches and attacks. Let's think about Sony and the PlayStation. Think about Microsoft and the Xbox. And maybe you have heard of Project Cerberus. I'm not promoting Microsoft, but they are doing some research on this, and they have identified characteristics, properties that we as a community can use as well. How to make affordable IoT hardware and the software that is being a side of it secure.
Well, there are things going on today, some that have just started. For example, ISA is working to define schemas that are a subset of IEC 62443, so for the OT domain, to apply to building management systems or to lower-end systems. So number one, part of that's starting to happen where the community is coming together as part of this ISA effort to do that. The other thing that's happening is that with the advent of IoT, there's been a lot of blurring of the lines between level 0 and level 1 in the Purdue model in terms of what is it process, what's it basic control. And so there's a new working group in ISA 99 for that as well, to start addressing security for the level 0/1 and really helping redefining what is level 0 and 1 in that model, because that's what the IEC standard uses as part of its framework for those things. So some of that work is starting to happen. Is it there yet? No, but it's beginning to happen. The other thing is that first of all, we need to define what is IoT, what is IIoT, what are those things, what is the scope that we're talking about when we're addressing that. And we also need to be looking at the solutions that we're providing. If we have a solution that is completely dependent on a connection to the cloud in order for it to function properly, that's a mistake. You have to have a system that can run, or most systems, I should say, any kind of critical system, certainly. You've got to make sure that you have the ability for that system to have some type of fail-safe operating mode if the connection to the cloud is lost. So all of that has to be taken into account in the design of these systems. And that's also where I think where we need to come together as a community to define how these types of systems need to operate. I have IoT devices in my home. Okay, if somebody wants to turn the lights on and off with a smart plug, I don't really care. But if somebody were to cause a pool, I don't have a pool, but if somebody were to cause the pool pump to cycle on and off rapidly and destroy the pool pump, then I would care. But the work is starting to happen. We're just not there yet. And there's probably more that needs to be imagined to be done in terms of pulling together what's already out there, because I agree with Daniel, pull together, we've got the best practices, we have requirements, let's just identify what's appropriate for where these devices play in the network.
Yeah, just to add to that, I agree. We don't have to build something from scratch, again new. There are a lot of things in place. I think these new considerations specifically for IoT is something someone needs to consolidate and give as some framework or some guideline that needs to be followed.
Yeah, a consolidation of what's already there rather than developing something completely new.
Yeah, and if it requires any new additions to be included.
Right. I think there are a couple of things when it comes to IoT devices, right? Let's say a lot of data gets collected about the user and about the behavior of the end user, whether it is smart cities or whether it is what your wearable watch and what have you. So then the question comes along: how do you maintain privacy of that data? So from that perspective, do we really need a new separate guideline around privacy just because it's coming, that data is coming from an IoT or an IoT device? I wouldn't think so, right? So the likes of a GDPR and the other privacy rules and regulations that are coming up around the world should pretty much suffice in terms of protecting the privacy of that information that is being collected by cloud providers, by the the IoT vendors or service providers, right? On the other hand, what makes IoT different is these devices are out there in the field. Okay, so these are less protected from a physical access than what would be your typical enterprise router or switch or a firewall or any other such device, right? So if you have a CCTV camera in your building, or if you have a any other such device that could be easily accessed, and that access could then be used to make lateral movement onto different connected devices, right? And most of the IoT devices today are now coming up with P2P capability, so they allow you to move from one device to the other, right? So I think that's one key area where, again, existing rules and regulations or existing best practices and standards may not have thought through very thoroughly, and they may need to be let's say supplemented with additional best practices of doing it.
Okay, so I loved your point, Michael, about the smart plug, because that's what even I keep talking about. So the criticality of the IoT device would depend on the purpose of that specific device. So if a smart plug is just powering on the TV, you wouldn't care. But let's say if the smart plug is powering on something on an OT environment or in a hospital, I think then the criticality or the whole nature of the product changes, just because of the deployment. So do you think that we need domain-specific guidelines for deployments as well as production for IoT devices, or we can have like a generic guideline for securing those devices?
So again, we have a lot of that with the IEC 62443. It specifically says that you're supposed to define the criticality of the use of that particular asset and group those into zones that need to be at a common security level, and then make sure that that security level is provided for those devices. So you need to say this part of your network needs, these devices on your network need to be SL3, these need to be SL2, and these can be SL1. So that's provided in terms of assigning your end devices into zones and defining the conduits between zones and what you're going to allow to communicate in the OT world. Okay, I think less so in the IT world. And now when you're going to the cloud, that becomes yet another matter, and what you allow to come back from the cloud, what control you have happening from the cloud, I think needs to be looked at a lot, because in OT, we're different than IT, so we're about the operational process. So our priorities are safety, reliability, and then confidentiality relating to the operational process rather than CIA.
So I just want to kind of bring out one more point from an architecture point of view. So we've been talking about whether guidelines and best practices are required, right? But from a security architecture point of view, if you look at it, the cloud actually plays a very important role in the entire IoT architecture, right? So all of the control, all of the upstream, downstream really happens at the cloud level. And that's where we need to put in the right kind of security architecture also in place. I'm not saying not at the field level. Obviously, at the field level, at the sensor level, at the gateway level, we definitely need the right controls in place. But you can additionally put the right controls at the gateway level itself. So, for example, on the Mirai botnet, you could have put an IPS signature to check the egress traffic Okay, so if you had any infected bots within your own network as an IoT within your enterprise network, you would have been able to track those. Okay, or to prevent from DDoS type of attacks, you then need to have a layered protection that would help you protect all the way up to whatever. I mean, the recent attack that we saw, although not a IoT attack, the one that happened just yesterday on GitHub was about 1.3 Tbps type of attack, right? So those volumes and those scales of attacks need to be prevented. So we need to have controls placed in the cloud to be able to prevent that, right? Third thing, most of the access to the applications, access to the sensors, whether it is controlling those sensors, authenticating those sensors, or drawing out reports and playing around with the data, all of that happens through applications. And most of these are web applications, typical HTTP, HTTPS traffic that would go through. So whatever you would do in an enterprise environment to protect your web application, i.e. put in penetration testing methodology in place, or put a web application firewall in place, also holds true from an IoT perspective to be applied at the cloud.
So, which brings me to my next question. Can you share your personal views or experience on the IoT attacks in the past or current that we have seen, for example, Mirai, Reaper? Anything that you want to share this? It's an open question to everyone.
Well, fortunately or perhaps unfortunately, we haven't seen any attacks on our devices so far. However, if we think of, again, the example Mirai, it was very obvious. It was very obvious that those devices are being used to hit availability of other services. But I believe that in the future, attacks will be more sophisticated, and those will be more dangerous that are not so obvious. If they, are targeted to compromise confidentiality, if you have a log that you can use with your smartphone, if you have a camera, and if you can compromise these devices and use them only then when it is necessary for you, then the owners have no clue that they have been compromised. There will be no obvious signs for compromisation.
Though I do not have any personal experience nor heard in my organization, but one thing I would like to share is a few years back I was flying from Bangalore to Pune, and the flight duration was just 1 hour, 15 minutes. And it was almost an hour, and 15 minutes it was supposed to land. It didn't land. It was just taking rounds and rounds and rounds. I just saw that, is this flight going to land at all? Because everyone is happily sleeping in the flight, early morning flight. Everyone was just sleeping. And just a thought that what if this flight does not land? Just that thought. Is there anything I want to do in my life now? Is this flight landing at all? What would happen if this flight is not going to land? Created so many, I would say, thoughts in my mind that I was kind of scared for a few minutes until the pilot announced that because there is some congestion, they would take another 20 minutes to land. So this was at a period when IoT was not a buzzword and we did not think of it. And recently I read that the sensors, everything that is used in flight to show the direction, to take safety measures for people who have occupied the flight, everything is based on sensors. There are so many sensors that you cannot think of. And if someone attacks that, and this has happened, so the flight, instead of moving forward, it laterally moved for some duration due to an attack. So when I read that, I thought, oh, what world we are in? What if all the devices are exploited and used for something that you don't expect? The entire human life is at threat. So Mirai is the future. It may be the beginning. The word Mirai itself is a Japanese word which says it is a future. So that is the future that we are going into. So just this experience is what I wanted to share.
Yeah, so as a service provider, as a cloud service provider, we host a lot of critical infrastructure for customers, right? And we see a number of DDoS attacks that happen on those customers. And of late, we have seen that attack volume and the frequency of those attacks go up, right? Very honestly, I wouldn't be able to tell you how many of that is attributed to an IoT network or an IoT attack or an IoT botnet per se. But I think it would be safe to assume that that is forming an incremental role in the in the overall DDoS attack surface, right? Then there was another case where for one of the customers, again it was the same often talked about Mirai botnet, but this time round it was a case of using analytics to find out which bots were infected or were there any endpoints in the network which were impacted by those by the worm or by the botnet, right? So that was the second example. And third, I think I want to quote one case study that that has been published by Verizon. So Verizon comes up with this data breach investigation report, and then along with that, they have a supplement to that which talks about certain use cases, right? And in the 2017 use case, I don't know what that thing is called. It's the database investigation report for sure, and then there is an annexure. I don't know what's that called, but obviously you can find it on the net. So there was this university who had almost 5,000 plus IoT-enabled devices, and these were these soda machines, these were the light bulbs, and all of that, right? And one fine day they suddenly saw a lot of network issues. So most of the users started calling back and saying that I'm not able to access the internet. And these guys had actually an air-gapped network. So the entire 5,000 IoT devices were on a separate network. However, what happened was they were using certain shared services. So the DNS server was common. So the campus network as well as the IoT network was using the same DNS server. And so it so happened that since once these 5,000 devices were actually broken into, they were contacting their command and control servers, right? And that was generating a huge amount of traffic. And because of that, the DNS server or DNS request actually slowed down. The legitimate requests were actually slowed down, right? So this was one example where not a huge damage was done, but definitely there was a lot of loss of efficiency because the students were not able to use the internet services from the campus for an extended period of time till they were able to actually clean the entire 5,000 devices. I mean, it's a very interesting read. You can look out for that report, and that gives details about how they went ahead cleaning those devices.
So in a way, I'm my own IoT guinea pig at home. For me, a denial of service attack today is more of an inconvenience than any kind of real threat. I think the real potential threat that lies out there is somebody hacking into those cloud services that I'm linking my IoT devices to and doing a broad scope attack across many households, across many industries, for the more commercial IoT type of products. I could imagine a criminal organization hacking into the company that I used for my smart door locks, and rather than and remaining under the radar and then selling that information to criminals locally so that they could unlock my door lock for them and let them into the house and there'd be no sign of break-in, turn off the alarm, that type of thing. But again, going back to more the IIoT and the OT side, I think any type of OT solution that interacts with the cloud and gets controls from the cloud is dependent on the cloud. A denial of service attack could be very debilitating in that scenario. They don't even have to come in to really disrupt my process. So that's why we have to be very careful about how we apply IIoT and utilize the cloud in those types of solutions. The old saying, just because you can doesn't mean you should, I think applies here. And we need to be very discriminate in our application of the cloud and providing control back into the infrastructure that we're monitoring and accessing.
Completely agree on that. So how do we define incident response, detection, mitigation for the IoT infrastructure? It may not be a reality today, but going forward, everything is going to be automated, right? So your hospitals, OT is already there. Transportation, hospitals, homes, offices. So how are we going to define incident response or detection and mitigation strategies for all the automation around us, because that's going to be the future anyways.
Okay, I think one of the I'm sorry for being a bit repetitive here, but one of the main things that stands out again when you talk about IoT and IIoT is really the scale. Okay, so whenever there is an incident, how do you manage the impact arising out of 1 million devices getting impacted? And when those devices get impacted, or when that breach happens, or when that incident happens, it's not just restricted to that particular service provider or that particular IoT network. It causes a lot of collateral damage as well. Okay, so a smart city that gets hacked into will impact the entire infrastructure of the city, which will lead to a lot more cascading effects and collateral damage. So incident response in this particular case, when it comes to IoT, and IoT needs to be more integrated with the law enforcement agencies, with the emergency response teams, which is typically not the case when a security incident happens. So if you have a web attack happening, or if you have a DDoS attack happening, or anything of that sort, you typically try to control it within your enterprise, within your own environment, right? You have more control over it. But in the case of IoT, I believe that a lot of coordination, a lot of integration would need to happen with the law enforcement agencies and the emergency response teams to ensure that impact on any particular system or architecture does not cascade and turn into a snowball effect.
So Michael, what do you think? Do we have to learn something from the OT environment that we can apply to IoT as well when it comes to incident response, specifically for OT as well?
Well, in order to have adequate incident response, we need to be able to have the ability to have forensics in terms of and determine what actually happened. That's going to be a big part of it. So we need to make sure that our IIoT devices have the ability to do at least some type of logging if possible. The real monitoring of change, and reporting of change, if simply we could have a sensor feeding into a wastewater treatment center, measuring the amount of chlorine going into the water, and if somebody changes the settings on that so that it underreports, and then the control system subsequently opens a valve to allow more chlorine in, something as subtle than that can impact many, many people. And we need the ability to at least detect when a change is made that's unexpected. Those are the things that we need to build into our IIoT type of systems to facilitate the forensics, to facilitate detection of something when it happens that shouldn't have happened, and act to respond quickly. So a lot of it is what we need is obviously to make sure that we bring our detection capabilities down to the sensor level, even if it's very rudimentary.
I believe we have to ensure certain prerequisites in order to ensure that we can react at all. So optimally, the device should be able to determine whether it has been compromised or not. And if so, it should report it back so that we can control multiple devices, many of them. So kind of a detection and logging capability, of course, and propagation of this information to the cloud service should be available optimally. And then based on this information, we can, detect breaches. We can then start the reaction process.
All right. But don't you think that's going to cause issues with private data or user privacy? I mean, today we buy IoT devices, or even enterprises for that matter, but there's no law, or there are standards and and laws as well. But as a user of an IoT product, I have no visibility into where the data is going. So, given in the future everything is going to be automated, don't you think it's going to cause problems with the users because they have absolutely no visibility about what exactly is going on in the device?
Of course it would. And we don't have a solution for it as of now. I think IoT is a big threat, we have not yet prepared for it. And we got to be prepared, awaken, and start working on things which will help us to have some protection in future.
I think, from a user privacy point of view, again, there is a certain unique thing that is there about IoT, right? Because even the government can actually have access to all of that information, right? So on the one hand, you have governments putting in policies around user privacy and how to protect, the enterprises and organizations from unwantedly benefiting from them commercially, right? But what happens when the government lays hands on that? Okay, so who then checks that behavior? Will we enter into a big brother monitoring kind of a mode, right? With most of the smart cities coming into picture, most of the things, everything getting connected, right? The personal devices getting connected to the internet, and so I think that's going to be a big challenge. How do you govern the government in terms of privacy?
All right. So yeah. So just before we finish, one final question to everyone. That's my favorite, and that's what the topic is. So your forecast on D-Day, or as Michael beautifully put it, Skynet. Any futuristic attack scenario that you see will cause a lot of issues on or cause a lot of damage to human life?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of other technology that has to come into being before we have a Skynet in terms of artificial intelligence. But so stepping back from that a little bit, I think part of the answer is it depends on how disciplined that we are in our application of IoT and IoT. I've heard people, some people write that, well, we can just throw the Purdue model out the window. Anything can talk with anything now. And so we can do all sorts of things because of that. I think that's a very undisciplined approach. It's equivalent to any of you ever walk into a network room and seen just a rat's nest of cables going into the equipment with no ability to tell what goes where? I mean, can you imagine having your communications between devices operating in the same way and being able to keep track of that and have proper firewall rules in place and be able to monitor the traffic and know and trace what's happening? No. I think if we allow that to happen, if we lose our discipline in the application of these products, it's going to happen. We're going to have significant problems very rapidly. But if we can be disciplined in our approach and be sensible in how we deploy these types of products, then we'll at least buy ourselves some time until Skynet can really come about.
I think until now we were paranoid about attacks and threats coming from certain areas. Now we got to be more paranoid because of the scale of IoT devices and think of number of attacks that are going to come, and we don't even have a strategy to mitigate those things or understand how, where, when things would come. So it's a completely, I would say, uncertain world that we would be getting with so many devices coming in.
Exactly. If we don't make them secure and we just cannot trust those devices in the future, then, it will be extremely disappointing and, from my perspective, dangerous. All those attacks that are going to hit, confidentiality and integrity rather than availability, those will be more dangerous than we have known before so far.
I think, Aseem, D-Day as a word is very ominous. Okay, so it basically means that is the world going to end, or D-Day is the day when the world is going to end. Okay, I personally don't think IoT is going to make the world end, or any attack through an IoT is going to make the world end. And if it does, you wouldn't be there to say that I was wrong. So I can very easily make that statement, right? So I don't think that's going to happen. So what is really going to happen? So these are what we've been seeing happening since the last 2 years, 3 years, right? The likes of the attacks into Jeep, or getting into the onboard controllers in flights, or the Mirai botnet attack, the IoT Reaper attacks, right? So all of this have happened, right? We are just going to see more and more scale going forward. And again, I'm coming back to the point where I mentioned about human safety. So that's going to be one important area to be aware of. And the problem is that for example, let's say I may decide to not use any IoT devices myself, stay away from all of those. But that still doesn't make me immune to any IoT attack, because there's a lot of collateral damage that I could be subjected to, right? So that's the worrisome part. There is not going to be any D-Day as far as I'm concerned. We will continue to face attacks. We will continue to learn as and when these attacks happen, and we'll continue to adapt, to those attacks. And that's how it's going to be. In the typical enterprise security world, you have attacks that lead to loss of efficiency, loss of brand reputation, loss of data, and loss of privacy. All of those will continue to happen in the IoT world as well.
So more jobs, more emerging areas to work on.
Could I just add one thing too? That what's missing from the cloud is the intelligence, the artificial intelligence. But the intelligence lies out there in the minds of the malicious people, the criminals, et cetera. So really, we have the infrastructure in place already for a massive attack coming from the cloud, controlled by the intelligence of people that are. So any of these systems that allow control from the cloud are subject to a type of Skynet type of attack, but the intelligence comes from the malicious people that have taken over that particular system in the cloud, and gives them a very broad reach across every house that subscribes to that service, or every industry that subscribes to that service. That's where our risk lies today, and I think that's very immediate.
All right, so I'll end that with a yes-no question. So do you think we are going to see a true or a pure IoT attack that focuses on sensors and does really bad things? So whenever we are speaking of IoT, I mean, people not from the IoT domain think of thermostats, smart plugs and all, which is really not the case. I mean, as OT has already been there for so many years before the IoT term was coined, right? We are going to see a lot of advancement and innovation in healthcare, for that matter. So, what do you think about?
Since it's a yes or no question, I would say it's an emphatic yes. We have seen pure OT attacks happening, and IT and OT attacks happening, and we will continue to see those happening.
I agree.
Me either.
Yeah,
All right,
positive yes from my end too.
With that, we open for questions.
So my question is to the Schneider gentleman there, Michael, if I'm correct. Yeah. So my question is again about OT and IIoT. So since you are in the business of supplying that and we are in the business of using that, we feel a lot of problem since the world is going towards everyday patching, and the meantime patch is going to be really in days now, not quarter or half yearly or anything. It will be every day we need to patch. We should be prepared for that. How are you planning? Because today, if I'm sure a couple of people would be there from the user perspective who are using OT and IIoT, patching is a pain there. The way we patch our IT system, we can't patch our OT system. Neither all the OT patches has to be ratified by the vendors, and it takes a lot of time to be ratified, and then it comes and there is a manual, very archaic way of doing patching. So it takes months together to even patch a system which has a 0-day vulnerability, which is already published. How are you really planning for that, and what is your strategy for that?
Well, first of all, you're right. Patching in OT is very different than patching in IT, because your hands are somewhat tied as to when you can attack the, right, but you've got to, you don't want to take down the system to do a patch. You've got to wait until an appropriate time when you have downtime in the system, or you keep redundant systems running at the software, at the level 2 in the Purdue model, and your SCADA system or your energy management system or your building management system, and you take that, you update one and you switch over to that, and then you the other one becomes the redundant one, and then you patch that. So that's one approach that you can take to manage your patching a little bit more efficiently. And it's also very important in the OT world because you want to test your patches before you apply them to make sure that you don't break something, which is another issue that you have to be concerned about. But patching is a fact of life today. I don't know that there's any way around that because the hackers are very creative, and we've got to have the ability to respond and provide a solution to those. So what we recommend in the OT world is that you do have a staging area, you do have a redundant system so that you can stage your patches and evaluate them to make sure that they're not going to cause any kind of an issue. Because you're not just patching our software, you're patching the operating system that our software is running on, which is your standard Windows environment, right?
What I'm referring to is not your system only. If you need patching on host OS patch, I need to get that approved from the OES. That means Schneider needs to approve my patch to be rolled out in a platform which is a Microsoft platform.
Right. Well,
That creates problems.
And it's a problem for us too. Obviously, we have to keep up with the patches from our vendors, whether it's we're using a Linux system or a Windows system. We've got to keep up with that. We do try to test our product as quickly as possible when a new patch is released, and have the relationships with the Microsoft and other vendors so that we know what's coming and that we can keep up with that. But obviously, there is a lag between when the patch is released and when we can actually finish our testing.
If I may supplement something, then I believe that for IoT, we have to change the entire architecture. The users don't have to bother about patches. We have to change the architecture and means of layered approach. Even if those layers are independent and separated from each other, then the device should identify that layer that is compromised and trigger patch automatically, and this will, change this entirely.
And you can do that often in IoT because you can afford to have some downtime, but in OT you can't because
there will be a slight difference between OT and IT, especially IoT.
Yes, my question is for Aseem, sir. Sir, yes. So, like ma'am said, we are not prepared yet, and like in India, we are very few companies working on IoT. Even they don't have good candidate, they don't have a good environment infrastructure. So why in India we are not having a good infrastructure in IoT? We are not preparing for IoT because IoT is the future. And we are lacking the things. People know, yes, IoT is the future. We all know that IoT is the future, but we are not going to do anything. We are not preparing for it. But why? Why it's happening?
Good question. I think everyone is trying from their end. If you, for example, if you look at domain specific, that's one of my concerns also, that every domain is doing their work in silos. I think we need to come as one community and focus on aspects of IoT which are common across domains, whether it is OT, whether it is transportation, healthcare, and so it's a difficult problem to solve because then there are organizations, they have their own agendas. If you look at even platforms for IoT, you would see different organizations coming up with their own platforms, even though they are open source. So we need to set the agenda aside and really focus on this. So from our perspective as a company, we have come up with IoT top 10 vulnerabilities because when we looked at OWASP, we figured that OWASP, though their initiative is good, but top 10 doesn't actually reflect what problems there are in IoT. So what we did was we collated the projects that we have done and tried to see what kind of or patterns in vulnerabilities in IoT. And that's when we we figured out that the actual problems in IoT are different from what OWASP says. So we came up with our own set of IoT vulnerabilities. We are also coming up with a security testing methodology, which we are going to open source as well, because we really want that if, I mean, it's bad for us because we may lose business, but then we need a specific standard, because we want other organizations to also chip in and come up with specific standards on how would you go about security testing IoT devices. Yeah, because it's not like a standard infrastructure testing. It's totally different, because the protocols are different, and we have the hardware element which was not there till now. So when you talk about network testing, you're only testing the software. We are not testing the hardware, but with IoT that changes.
What was the problem when your team started to work into IoT, or your team initiated the work that okay, we are going to test the IoTs and we will do some kind of IoT event testing. So what was the problem as a company perspective or as a director? I think the same problem is other directors are also facing same problem. Other companies also may facing some same problem. So what is your?
So yeah, the question is twofold here. We started getting requests for testing of embedded system, and then we were also in the process of rolling out another conference in Europe, and that's when we figured out there's no point taking this conference in Europe, because there are tons of conferences there. So let's try and solve a problem. So then we looked at from conference perspective. There were a lot of software security conferences, but nobody was talking about from an industry perspective on the attacks on hardware and the defenses on hardware. And that's when we decided, okay, we're going to do a hardware security conference in Europe. And we started looking at it, and I personally got interested into hardware security because of that. And then we started researching on hardware, and that's how we got into IoT testing.
I think in the interest of time, we have to take only one last question. So I'll just...
So thanks for a wonderful panel discussion. So I'm in the business of providing sensor-based solutions for hospitals, something you mentioned multiple times.
God bless you.
So at least in the context, but not from a security, I'm doing more solutioning for what they need for workflows. From what I've seen in the context of Indian hospitals, at least right now, I'm not sure if they're ready to be good paymasters for security solutions. They're difficult enough to take solutions from me, and then somebody says, okay, by the way, you also now need to secure all this stuff. I'm not sure, I could be wrong, but I'm not sure if they're ready to pay unless, and that's what I worry. That's a question for you guys. Till they see something which is really, and it's not about a ransomware or a data hack. I think until they see an actual critical attack to a patient or to a human life, I don't see them becoming good paymasters. That's one question. The other, do you agree with that? The second question is, do you see something more like a more secure system for hospitals, maybe using some kind of a private blockchain or something like that, which makes it a little bit better? These are the two questions. Thanks.
I'm not sure I understood one of the words, but for hospitals, like the electrical distribution system, we take that security there seriously. We provide operating theater solutions. Security's got to be an integral part of that, because if the electricity is cut off when somebody's on the operating table, they're in serious trouble, right? So it does have to be taken into account throughout the hospital infrastructure behind the scenes. So many people see the HIPAA side of things where they have to be compliant with all those rules, but on the backside, we've got all these patients on oxygen machines and ventilators and all sorts of other life support systems that are plugged into different electrical network, and that's got to be kept up and running. There's rules for backup generation and making sure that comes on in a certain amount of time. All of that has got to have cybersecurity integrated into it if we're going to truly protect our patients, the patients in the hospitals, from all problems that might occur. First of all, do no harm, right? So we want to keep that from happening.
So I totally agree with you. It's going to take a human life to make them understand that there is a serious problem. Right now, we don't have the amount of automation that we are talking about as far as IoT is concerned, and the networks are in silos. But once we have all the automation, I'm pretty sure that we're going to see a lot of attacks, targeted attacks, focusing specific IoT devices within the hospitals. I mean, to look at it currently, I mean, the state in which the networks run in hospitals is not good. So somebody who has experience in network security can cause a lot of damage in hospitals. And yeah, I think it's going to take human life for them, an important human life, a politician or a rich person dying, for them to understand the importance of securing the infrastructure.
All right, guys, I know that there are a lot of questions. I still see some hands. I request you to take those questions offline. So the panel will be here for some time. You can ask them those questions. With that, I thank Aseem and the entire panel. It was really a sincere discussion, and still there is a lot to be done in the IoT field. So a big round of applause for the entire panel. Thank you.